Stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and Chief Story Maker of Elkins Consulting. We share stories for a lot of reasons, to persuade, to entertain, and to connect. What we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves, and that how we tell those stories matters. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're being perceived by the people you're interacting with. In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you. You'll nod your head in understanding, and we'll dig into the lessons from each of those situations. When I'm working with clients, I remind them to listen for understanding, not to respond. But during this podcast, I'm asking you to listen and actually consider your related stories, to listen and consider which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. I've had the pleasure of interviewing Suzanne Spaner from Meeting Matchmakers. We have so much in common in terms of our experience with the hospitality industry, and I just knew she'd have some great conversation and stories. Hello, Suzanne Spaner. What a treat to have you on this podcast today. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for inviting me, Sarah.
I met Suzanne, for our listeners, a little background. I met Suzanne because our mutual friend Robin Bennett, suggested that I talk to her about helping me plan the No Longer Virtual conference that will come up in 2019 in February in Atlanta. And I reached out to her even though my first thought was, I've been planning events all my life. I don't really need help. But I figured if Robin suggested that I talk to Suzanne, I would talk to her. And within 15 minutes, I knew it was the right thing to do. Not because I couldn't do it myself, but because it was such a pleasure to be able to delegate some of the load off of my own shoulders so that I could really focus on the experience of my guests, which is something normally I just do all by myself, and I forget how stressed I am until just afterward when I'm trying to recover.
Exactly.
So Suzanne, I'd love to know something. This is what I ask all of my guests at the beginning of the podcast is, tell us something that most people don't know about you, something we won't find in your resume or your LinkedIn profile.
So I don't often talk about this, except on our first call, I did mention to you and you said, oh, you should write an article about this. And I just haven't had time, so I want to share it with you now. I was not a runner growing up. And in school, I remember specifically a middle school gym teacher, she always made us run a mile around the track. And I'd get around lap 1, I'd get around lap 2, and I'm like, how am I going to do lap 3 and 4? There's no way, I'm not going to make it. And I'd slow down, and she didn't want us to walk. She wanted us to really run, or like a fast jog. So anyway, by the time I finished, every time I remember thinking, I don't know how I did that. It was exhausting. It was horrible. I did not enjoy it. Fast forward, in 2002, I decided really kind of out of the blue that I was going to run a marathon. And going from someone who not only didn't like running, but just the thought of a marathon was like way out of reach for me. But I was driven by, at the time, it was like becoming very popular to run a marathon for a cause. And my mother has rheumatoid arthritis. And so I decided that I really wanted to help fund for a cure, and the best way I could think to do that was to do something that was completely, in my mind, outside the realm of possibilities, so that people would want to partner with me and, you know, donate money to the foundation, knowing that this wasn't something that was going to be easy. And I feel like I really got a lot of support and people rallied around me. I blew out the fundraising goal that I had that year. But what was even more miraculous is that I actually ran the marathon. I did the run-walk method. So I ran a mile, walked a minute. And I learned about it along the way from one of the amazing coaches. It was called the Joints in Motion program because it was part of the Arthritis Foundation. And that experience to me, like being in Honolulu, running a marathon, and just, I remember getting to the top of one of the peaks in one of the mountains, and we started the race like 6 a.m. So I got to run as the sun was rising. You know, I was rising up the mountain. It was just, everything was like, the hills were alive. You know, it was just such a cool, amazing experience. And I thought to myself, there's nothing in life that you can't do. There's really nothing you can't do. There are things that maybe you don't want to do because they might be dangerous. Like, I'm not so into the idea of bungee jumping or skydiving, but it's possible. I feel like anything in life is possible if you have the right outlook, the right attitude, and you just believe in yourself. And that's really what that experience taught me. I came back from it and I was still on that high. They call it the marathon high. I'm like, I need to get other people to do this with me. I can't just have this high by myself. So the following year in 2003, I recruited a team. I think there was like 8 or 10 of us. And I convinced them to go to Alaska and run a marathon in Alaska. They had 2 options, a hike or a marathon. And the first year, I think for Honolulu, I raised like $10,000. So I'm like, I'm going to go big. And so the second year with this group, I think there was 8 of us. We raised over $25,000. I'm going to raise $30,000 that year. And everyone was in the same boat. They're like, how are we going to raise this money? I don't know how this is going to happen. I said, if I could run a marathon, you can do it. We could do this. So we had meetings and we decided on different fundraisers. And it was just so exciting. It was such a fun time, training together. And like I said, half of the group did the marathon and the other half did the hike. And then the following year was the last year. I decided, okay, I'm going to do this one more time. And so that year, my sister, I got her involved, to go to Alaska. So I said, let's do this again, just the 2 of us. So we decided, because it was our mom, like we, both had huge passion for raising money for the foundation for arthritis, that we were going to go to Dublin. And my sister's not into running, like doing a marathon. So they had a hike. So we were going to do the hike in Dublin. And I got this great idea. I'm like, I think we could, potentially raise more money if we did a raffle. She's like, what are we going to raffle away? I said, we're going to charge $100 a ticket. And everyone who gives $100 gets their name in. And if they give $200, they get their name in twice. And we're going to raffle off a free trip to Dublin with us. You have no idea. We raised money in so fast. We beat our goal. We went way over. And then it came time to draw the names. And we had one of my friends do it so that no one would think we rigged it. And he pulls the name out of the hat, and guess whose name it was?
His own.
No, my grandmother's. No. We called her. We're like, guess what? You won a free trip to Dublin. She laughed so hard. She's like, I'm not going anywhere. Give it to someone else. So then we pulled another name, and the person who won was thrilled, and it was just like such a wonderful experience. But I don't talk about that so much on LinkedIn. So that's my story.
Wow. That is a great story. I love it. And the theme that keeps coming across in this podcast, almost every episode, there's this back theme that is not only can you do things, but when you surround yourself with other people who are enthusiastic and supporters, then it makes it even more likely you're going to be successful. And when you say you can do pretty much anything that you choose to do, and I would add that it's going to be a lot more likely you'll be successful if you surround yourself with people who believe in you and support you in it. Definitely. And I'm always amazed at people who choose to spend time with people who don't behave that way. Why would you put yourself in a position where you're spending time with somebody who doesn't treat you like you can do anything?
I think that sometimes happens when you don't believe in yourself and you don't have the self-esteem or self-confidence. So part of it is like you don't really recognize that you're surrounding yourself with people who are kind of downers or negative. And then as you become more aware of yourself and you get into a realm, like I almost call it of enlightenment, where you're like, oh, this is who I really am. Mm-hmm. That's who I should surround myself with. And I want to be around people who give and share and learn and grow and, are joyful and are happy when you're doing well and when things are going great in your life and they're not feeling those, kind of negative feelings of jealousy or they want to take it away from you. So I think it's all kind of an evolution because I've kind of gone through that wave.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And I think women in particular go through it.
Right.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about it quite that way, but you're right. I remember surrounding myself with more and more positive, encouraging people as I've gotten older and realized I'm going to be picky about who I spend my time with, exactly. Including family. If I'm around somebody in my family that's not particularly kind or encouraging, I can still have a relationship with that person, but I can also choose not to spend time with them. So let's get into the meat of our podcast recording, the theme. And as I mentioned before, you plan events, but it's way more than that. It's called Meeting Matchmakers is your company. And when we talked, the first questions you asked were pretty general questions, but I went into great detail about how I plan events, particularly no longer virtual. So my theory is that everyone at some point or another has to plan an event. And it could be a minor event, it could be a meeting, it could be a birthday party, it could be a big event, it could be a wedding or a conference. And the thoughts that go into my head when I'm first planning something are really important when I'm planning something. So the first one is, how are my guests going to get to wherever we go? But the second one is, what stories will they tell after they leave? So kind of what are key takeaways? And I'd love to hear a story about how you plan an event and a story maybe that came out of it.
So I had a client when I was working at the Ritz-Carlton, and I was in sales, and he was only looking at hotels in Atlanta, and he wasn't sure which direction he wanted to go. He had never booked a Ritz-Carlton before. And so my job, of course, was to sell him on why we were the perfect option for him. So one day I invited him over. We sat down lobby, we were talking, and he said, I need themes. I need something to make me decide this is the right option. This is the right venue. So I said, well, what's important to you? And it's similar to what you're talking about. He's like, I want to have something catchy. I want to have something where everyone's like, oh my gosh, I can't miss this. I have to be there. And they rotated East Coast, West Coast every other year. So this was his East Coast city. And he said, I want it where our attendance grows, but it's not because I'm convincing people. I want people to convince each other that they need to be there. So I was like, okay, let's talk. And then we were like, okay, Atlanta, peaches, Vidalia onions. We started thinking about everything like Southern food because, a big part of an event and a takeaway was the food good. Because if the food wasn't good, no matter how good your content is, no matter how, people were there, everyone's going to leave saying, oh my gosh, the food was terrible. So you don't want that way of everything else that you have going for you. So fortunately, the Ritz-Carlton, we had very, exclusive chefs, people who would go outside the box, do absolutely anything. If it wasn't on the menus already, like they were creative, came up with anything you wanted. So
I can agree with that because I had my first no longer virtual at the Ritz in downtown Atlanta. So they provided extraordinary food and service. But okay, go on.
So he wasn't wanting to do peaches or onions. And all of a sudden I watched as we're brainstorming, this big light bulb went off and he said, what about grits? And we both at the same time were like, that's perfect. So we came up with the idea of putting on the grits at the Ritz. So it was like a done deal after that. We signed up. I mean, they had such a fabulous event. And that's exactly what happened. The chefs were like, grits? Okay. And they came up with every kind of combination with grits you can imagine. They had grits with fruit. They had grits with vegetables. They made these pretty sauces. They made grits where you didn't even know grits tasted so good. So like everything was themed around grits. And it was so much fun. We laughed about it for years and years and years. We're always like, can we top putting on the grits at the Ritz? So
you mentioned earlier, this is part of why I like this story so much, is that people are still talking about it. So tell me a little bit about that.
Just like in years after that, I don't feel like we ever had something quite as catchy. Just, the whole song of putting on the Ritz.
Uh-huh.
So it just meshed well together. I don't want to be a downer on the podcast, but it's kind of a sad story because this same client a few years ago, he passed away. So I haven't gotten to hear any more about putting on the grits at the Ritz, but the people who took over for him, that was the first thing they said to me when they met me. They're like, you helped. I said, yeah, that was like the first year we met. It was 10 years ago. That was, our big, wow, we made this happen. So.
Oh, wow. There's so much more to this that I'm picking up now as we're talking. And I talk a lot about personal brand. Some people, I kind of get tired of that phrase because it's so overused. And so sometimes I just replace it with reputation. And the reality is that that story is part of your reputation, particularly with that group. Mm-hmm. And when you put together an event that leads to those kinds of stories, it impacts your reputation and your brand, which is why it's so important that you do this in a positive way. So I was mentioning this earlier in our conversation before we hit record. When I worked as a director of sales at a hotel, I planned a lot of weddings and rehearsal dinners with my clients. And there's one in particular that always pops into my head when I think about the worst case, the Bridezilla stuff. And I had met with this young bride and her mom, and I mean young, like 22. I'd met with them a couple times, so they had already decided on our location for the room block and for the reception afterward. And at one point, they came in to have a meeting with me to talk more about details and catering and decorations. And it was the bride and her groom, the mother of the bride, and the bride's best friend. And we're sitting in my office, and they're talking about all the details. And every once in a while, I could see the bride's hackles go up. So this young bride said, "It's my wedding," at least 4 times in about a 15-minute conversation. And I could see the mom was getting pretty annoyed, even though she was excited for this and she really liked the groom. And the maid of honor, her best friend, was really getting annoyed. And I'm watching these interactions and I'm kind of chuckling because I've seen it before. But this time I decided to say something. And I said to the bride, can we just stop for a second? Her eyebrows went up and she really didn't want to listen to me. Her mom kind of elbowed her like, "You need to listen." And then I said, "Look, I get that this is your special day and that this is really important to you, but it's also your groom's special day. It's not just your wedding, it's his too. And even if he doesn't have any opinion on it, it belongs to both of you. Even more importantly, the only thing that you can think about are your own needs for your wedding day. Then your guests aren't going to have any fun. And if your guests don't have any fun, you're not going to have fun either. So let's backtrack just a little bit and let's think about what stories you want your guests to tell when they leave your wedding reception. What do you want them to say?" And we got down to a few major things. One was, she said, "I want them to talk about how beautiful I look." Well, that's honest. I'm good with that. There's no judgment there. Right. You're a bride, you do. You want people to say, "Wow, she was such a beautiful bride." So I said, okay, that's reasonable. So make sure that when you're planning your budget, plan to really take the time, and that's a big part of your budget, to spend the time and the money on the dress, the hair, the makeup. I said, "What else?" And she said, "Well, I really want people to talk about how much fun they had." And I said, "Fun in what way?" And she said, "Well, like good music and dancing." I said, "Okay, so let's talk about the DJ or the band that you want to have." It just changed the whole dynamic, this conversation. And she I could tell that she wanted to hold on, and she was this close to saying, "It's my wedding," at least one more time. But it changed the dynamic because I think she realized that it was important what her guests thought about what happened. It wasn't just about her. So I'm guessing that you have a story similar to that.
So I just recently planned an event for what I thought was a company in Boston, but they merged with 2 other companies after I started working with them. So there was another company out of Utah, and there was a third company that wasn't quite as involved, but they were part of the event. So I thought the event was going one way. It was going to be in New York, and the planner and I, we had a really good rapport, and he was very excited. He went to New York, and he was checking out these 2 hotels. One was actually in northern Jersey because it was a little less expensive. The other was in Times Square. And then at the last minute, the other company that was involved said, "Well, I think we want to have it at an off-site venue, and they could do the rooms, like the guest rooms, at a hotel nearby." So he and I weren't really planning on that, and so we had to kind of do a last minute scramble. We found a really great venue and he went to check it out. It turns out when he went back to the team to vote, they decided on the venue. So now we had to coordinate a few more pieces of the puzzle, because when it's all in the hotel, you know, you have the food, you have the decor, you have everything all in one place. So now we were kind of shuffling things around. It was interesting working with this group because there was a lot of people behind the scenes that the person that I was planning with was kind of getting all this information in his ear, like, hey, do this, can you do this, can you do this? So as we were going, he and I, again, we just had such a good rapport. We were enjoying planning this out. He said, oh, now they want me to do, you know, sponsored dinners at restaurants nearby. And we're thinking, because we're in Boston, it's more expensive to fly our whole team down. Maybe we should, you know, use some other mode of transport. And I said, what are you thinking? Like the train or a bus? He's like, exactly, like Amtrak, or, you know, I don't know what's going to be the most cost effective. And then fast forward, he's like, now, you know, for the dinners, they want to do entertainment and we want to get everybody together and do like some kind of music. So he's like throwing all these really amazing ideas my way. But technically, the way I market meeting matchmakers and the way I've always worked with clients is I help them to do the site selection. So I research, you know, different cities, depending on the level of service they want. I look into different hotels for them. And then if they want to go visit, I set up the site tours. I arrange, you know, transportation to get them to and from their site tours in the airport. And then once they select their shortlist, I help negotiate the contract with the hotels and get them the best concessions and value and all of this. So all the things he was asking me are not really part of what we offer, because our whole model is offering a free service. Everyone says, I don't understand how you do this. So this is the big secret. You're the first one. I'm on a official Talking About Meetings podcast. And the hotels pay us a commission. I'm a travel agent, and they pay us based on the room block. So all these things he was asking me, I'm thinking, I don't mind doing it. It would be fun. I normally outsource it to other people. And he said, I don't want to work with anyone else. He was like adamant. I was going to send him to one of my destination management partners who knows New York inside out. He's like, no, I want you to do it for us. So I said, well, let me look into it. Other people that are in my field, in my industry, they do these things, but they do charge a fee for it. And I was shocked at his answer. He's like, I'll pay for you to do it. I'll pay for your time. I don't mind.
Of course.
I'm thinking, wow, okay. Like, you might think it's funny, but I've been in business for 8 years. No one's ever offered to pay me. None of my clients have ever said, hey, let me pay you something, because that's just not the way I work, you know? So I went and I called some people who do what I do, but they, you know, also do these extra services, and they gave me different package prices. I called him back. I said, well, I could do it for this or for this. What do you think? He's like, yeah, and he threw out an amount, and I was fine with it because it was my first time. I'm like, all right, let me see how it goes. So as I got more into it, I realized how much I loved it. And at the end, you know, he just, whatever it was, we wound up getting an 80s cover band, and they were amazing. And I found, I came up with the idea, instead of doing multiple dine around options for the restaurant, I found one restaurant that we could buy out the entire place. And then they had this huge room upstairs so we could do the music after and not have to shuffle people from 10 different restaurants to one restaurant at the end. And just everything, we just kept on having such a good vibe. It was all working out so smoothly. So then at the very end, he said, you know, I think you've spent a lot more time on this than we had first talked about. I said, yeah, I did. I said, but I'm not like a CPA. Like, I didn't keep track of my hours. You know, like, that whole concept is just not my style at all. Uh-huh. So I said, but I do need to do your invoice. So he kind of surprised me, and he said, go ahead and double it. And I got paid by my first client. I wasn't even expecting any money at all. And then he went ahead and doubled it. And I'm like, okay, I think I could do this more often.
That's awesome.
Now, like, my web designer, we've been talking, and she said, let's add a section, because I still want the core business to be the same, but you might have a section that's like, we're not sure what to call it yet, but premium services or something. If I have that good rapport and someone doesn't want me to turn them over and outsource them somewhere else, I feel like, why not? Our team can handle it, and we'll just get it done.
Wow, yeah. That's terrific.
So
that sounds like so much fun. And it sounds like he really, well, let me back up a little bit. One of the most difficult things that I've experienced in all of my career is when there are multiple decision makers, like working with a board, and everyone has to have a say in something, it makes making a decision really difficult. And it sounds like that guy had a lot of input, but not necessarily decision makers. But it also sounds like he really had an idea, a general idea of how he wanted people to experience this time with him. And I think about that a lot in terms of storytelling. It just comes right back to, what do you want the story to be? And I think sometimes people forget that all of the stories are part of your event, particularly the things that go wrong. When my husband and I got married, it was almost 21 years ago. And it had been raining all week, and the plan was to have the ceremony outside in the DC area in Old Town Alexandria. And it had been raining all week. It rained for the rehearsal dinner Friday night. It rained all morning. And then it just stopped. At about 11 o'clock that morning, it just stopped raining. And it was perfect and beautiful outside. And my grandmother had broken her hip 2 weeks before my wedding. And she lived in a facility in Rockville, Maryland, which was about an hour drive from where we were having the wedding. And my aunt said, don't worry, I'll get her there. They were going to get a special wheelchair accessible taxi to go to her facility. She was, like I said, up in Rockville, Maryland. And they had this whole plan. And we got down to the wedding site, which was an old museum, a mansion right on the water. It was just beautiful. And I was upstairs. I had just gotten my dress on, and we were getting ready to start. And the string trio was going, and my fiance was down ready to go. And my sister was up there next to me, and my other 3 bridesmaids. And we were all just giddy, you know, having a great time and waiting to start. And my mother comes up with this, she's so stressed out because my grandmother's not there yet. This is on my dad's side, my dad's mother. So I remember standing there at the top of the stairs, ready to walk down the stairs to go to the ceremony. And I had a choice. We could just get started and she'll arrive when she arrives, or we can wait. And the downside to waiting was that we'd have to probably pay more for the string trio because they were going to play longer. They were only there for the ceremony. And people would be waiting around. And I said to my mom, I'm going to wait till she gets here. She said, but we don't know when she's going to get here. And she was all stressed out about it. And I said, it doesn't matter. You can't start without me. And I'm not walking until my grandmother gets here.
Right.
And she was there about 20 minutes later. And in the meantime, I had them send a message down to my fiance at the time and said, please do something to entertain our guests. Maybe have the servers start serving wine. And he's like, okay. So all of our guests, by the time I walked down the aisle, all the guests that wanted one had a glass of wine in their hand. And it ended up being a major source of comfort for our guests. And it changed the whole dynamic of the wedding. Not that it started late, but that led to each of them having a glass of wine in their hand. It ended up becoming a lot less formal. People who didn't know each other started talking to each other.
Oh, so nice.
And that's part of the story of that wedding. So even though it went wrong, it really didn't go wrong. So I think that's a big part of every event, is how you choose to tell the story about it.
And also, it's such a nice memory for you, knowing your grandmother got to see you get married and that she didn't
Right.
get the ceremony.
Exactly.
I think that's like the most beautiful way to start your life. Like, you had the right intentions, the right mindset, you know, but it wasn't all about you. It was really about everybody and about her being a part of your big day.
I think people forget sometimes that they are in charge. There's just this assumption that you have to stay with the schedule, or you have to do this, or you have to do that. And across the board in life, I think that's a mistake to think about things that way. But particularly when you're talking about a major event like that, giving in to the pressures of what you're supposed to be doing or what you should be doing. And so I'm guessing you have a story that can kind of dovetail for that one.
I mean, I guess I could talk about, I have a client that does an incentive trip every year. And it's fascinating to me because the event is always held in February or March in the first quarter of the year because they are awarding the sales managers that had reached their goals, I think it's the top 10% of the sales team. And so they want to do the event in the first quarter so that they, can celebrate right away after they won. But they also need time to audit and figure out who actually won and gets to go on the trip. So from my perspective, it's always interesting trying to maneuver through the contract phase because we're contracting with the hotel a certain room block, but we don't actually know if that's the right number of winners because we're contracting actually between May and June is when we usually contract for the following year. So the actual audit and all the process of who's going to be the winner, who's going to go, doesn't happen until end of January, beginning of February. So what's funny is I've been planning this for a few years. They always like to go to a passport destination, and they do that because they want it to be, like you say, memorable and special and not something you would normally just go on your own. So instead of it being like a nice resort in Florida, they want it to be an island getaway. It's usually like Caribbean, somewhere unique. And so I'm tasked with finding this unique, perfect venue every time. So one year they went somewhere and they loved it. And she called me. We usually, before they go on the trip, I'm trying to give you all information at once, we try to plan out where they're going to go the following year so that they can announce it at the awards dinner. Like, congratulations, you won for this past year, but we want you to also beat your numbers this year because next year's trip you're going to, and then they tell them. So,
oh no.
So it's fine because they go away February or March. So starting in like December, January, they tell me, help us find where we're going to go. And we usually narrow it down to like 3 destinations. So this one year they loved where they were, and we had narrowed it down and we figured out where they were going to announce they were going the next year. And then all of a sudden, literally the day before the award ceremony, while they're at the destination, I get a WhatsApp. I always get WhatsApp updates as they're away. And my client says, you're not going to believe this. They don't want to go where we had in mind for next year. And I said, what do you mean? This is for tomorrow. They're announcing it tomorrow. What are we going to do? She said, they want to stay where they are right now. They want to come back to this resort. Again, can you check this date and this date? And do they have availability? So I'm scrambling with the sales manager. We're trying to put it all together. It turned out the hotel they were in had availability the following year. And then I went into the weekend. I didn't hear anything because their awards dinner's on a Saturday night. And Sunday morning, I texted her and I was like, so did they announce it? Are they going back to the same hotel? Everything's good to go. And she said, you're not going to believe this. They announced a totally different place. I said, what do you mean? She's like, they just said, we're going, here. And I said, what? And she's like, we're just going to have to figure it out. So she, you talk about the behind the scenes story. To me, it's hysterical. They don't announce a hotel. They just say, we're going to, I'm making this up, Aruba, or we're going,
or St. Thomas, or right.
But she and I have to put in so much legwork and making sure it's the perfect hotel. And she has all these requirements leading up to it. It has to be a direct flight. Primarily a lot of the attendees are coming from Atlanta. They have different sales offices across the country, but most of them are here. So it has to be not only direct, nonstop flights, certain amount of hours. There's all these requirements. But they're just we're going here. And so, we made it happen and they went there. But it was just interesting, their decision-making process around it. So now whenever they're planning events, I always tell myself, it's not going to be what you think it's going to be. It's probably going to change 10 to 20 times before it's final. And even when you think it's final, it's still not final because the pen is almost on the paper of the contract, and they'll call me and be like, can we change the room one more time? Can we do this? So, it has actually been a lot of fun, and it's tested all my flexibility muscles, but that's probably one of my funnier stories. It turns out, though, all the attendees have no idea. They go on this trip. They have the most amazing time. They can't wait to try to win for the next year, and it works out for them, amazing. They have no idea what goes on behind the scenes. None.
And I think that is a testament to the planners and the people behind the scenes, because that's the whole point, is that they're supposed to show up and not know. Exactly. And at the same time, though, I always come back to the fact that people don't choose to know, they're not curious to know, and which is why you end up with the near disaster of picking the wrong spot or picking a different spot at the last minute, because they have no idea what goes into it.
Right.
I'm always a little bit puzzled by that, but that's hilarious. That's really funny. So I'm one of those people, and I'm guessing you are too, that when I go to an event, I'm watching all the behind the scenes stuff that's going on, and I'm super aware of it.
Yeah.
I think more people would enjoy it if they knew. I think they'd find it interesting and entertaining if they just paid attention to those details just a few times. And what I realized years ago is that long before I started performing musically as a professional musician, when I would go to a show, whether it was on a stage like a musical theater or drama, or a band or any kind of theater experience, I always watched the dynamics among the people on the stage. I was always watching for the crew members running back behind to hand the guitarist a new guitar that was fully, has all the strings on it because one of their strings broke during the last song, or watching a crew member move something on the stage in the middle of a production because it was in the wrong spot and the actor needed that cue. And I'm always watching that stuff, and I'll say something afterward, and whoever's with me says, "Oh, I didn't see that at all." And I think that's part of how people can tell better stories, is if they do pay attention to those details.
Details, yeah.
So the details that you put in, when we talked a little bit about how guests would get to an event, and what are your key details when you're working with a client on an event?
So it's interesting. During the course of my career before I started this business, I at one point was working as a corporate trainer for Marriott, and I went around to the hotels, and we were going through this whole change from a manual process of scheduling systems and making it all move over to automated. So for example, the housekeeping department would schedule their team, and the ladies would be writing in like, so-and-so is working from this time to this time. Then they'd, erase it out with pencil and move the time. So we taught them how to put it into the computer, and then there was kind of this really cool chart where they could just click and point and drag, and they called it drag and drop their schedules into the system, and it automatically linked up to the payroll clock, the time clock where they would clock in and out. The reason I tell you this is that experience taught me so much about every single department in the hotel. Whereas if I was just a sales manager and I was what we call front of the house, just selling the groups on why they should come. And for me, it was very enjoyable having that position because I like talking to people. I like meeting people. I enjoy showing them around beautiful hotel and explaining, why this would be the best pick for them. I have maybe a gift of getting to know people and really trying to understand what makes them tick and not making it about the sale, but more about them and, their likes, their needs, their preferences, like, putting on the grits, figuring it out, like brainstorming,
right.
But because I had this really amazing opportunity to get to know everyone in what we call the back of the house, housekeeping, we had engineers, we had security team, the bellhop, the concierge, like everyone in the hotel. You can't run a hotel without all of these very critical positions, even reservations. You can't fill the hotel without amazing people on the phone answering all day long. So I'd go behind the front desk and I'd go meet with the reservation team, and just having an awareness of how the whole building, how everything ticks, helps me when clients, for example, will say to me, "I don't understand why the check-in time is 3 p.m. or 4 p.m. Like, can't you help us and get us in there at noon?" So I would explain to them that in the event the hotel's not sold out the night before, we would love to get you in at noon. But if they're in a complete sellout, you have housekeepers going floor to floor to floor trying to clean the rooms, and the people that are leaving before you, they don't have to check out till 11 a.m. or 12 p.m. So you can't get in at 12 when they're just getting out at 12. We need to give them a certain window of time to go in and do a nice job and make it look presentable and ready for you. And I think having those conversations and really, like, for me, not just saying it because I'm in sales and this is what my director told me, or this is what is like the pitch, you know, the sales pitch. Mm-hmm. It's like, it's more like an education. I try to educate people on why things are the way they are in the hotels. And sometimes I'll have a client say, I don't understand, why is the room rate so high? And I feel like because I've had so many conversations with revenue managers, and I'm fascinated by revenue management because I love numbers. I used to be in accounting. Like, I like the blend of sales side, but also the revenue, and like making sure it all meshes. So I can explain, you know, there's certain seasons where it's higher demand, and if you're willing to move your dates, like I can educate the client and say, you want a better deal? I'll help you get a better deal, but you can't go to Florida, you know, January through March and get a good deal because it's colder months and everybody's going to Florida. Exactly. Right. And you know, for the newer planners, it's really helpful. For the seasoned planners, I mean, most of them get it. It's not something that's so hard for them, but sometimes it's hard for them to keep up with when the citywides are. Like, I do a lot of research for them to try to educate them and help steer them in a direction where their needs are met. So if someone gives me a budget, I try to meet their budget, but it might not necessarily be where they originally thought they were going. Like in this example, instead of Florida, I might say, hey, why don't we consider North Carolina? Or, you know, we're still going to be in the Southeast, but not necessarily where it's going to be $400 rooms a night.
Right.
So,
and, you know, that it's interesting because when people are curious, when they actually ask a question that they want an answer to, it opens all kinds of opportunity, not only for education, but for connecting with them in a different way.
Right.
And when I worked when I was the director of sales at the hotel, I remember being in my office and hearing a guy berating one of my front desk staff. This was a client berating somebody that worked for me. And I was really, that's not okay in any way, especially because there's nothing she could do. So I walked around to the desk and I said, excuse me, can I help you with this? It's not acceptable for you to speak to my front desk staff this way. So what is the problem? And he was really upset because his bed wasn't perfect. His mattress had a little bit of a dip in it. And I said, oh, well, that must have been uncomfortable. I'm sorry. Are you staying with us another night? And he said, yes, I had planned to, but I'll check out. And I said, I'd be happy to replace the mattress or put you in a different room. And he said, you can replace the mattress in one day? I said, oh, absolutely, we could do that. I said, here's the thing, though. We don't sleep in all the beds. So unless you tell us when one isn't exactly right, we don't know. And the light bulb went on in his head. You could see his eyes light up because he hadn't thought about that. The fact that us staff, we don't sleep in the beds. So unless a customer says this bed is starting to fail, there's no way we would know. Yeah. I mean, unless it's a visible dip, and that, you know, our housekeeping staff definitely knew to let us know if there was a visible problem. But if it wasn't visible, anyway, it was kind of funny because it was one of those opportunities. And at that moment, he actually apologized to the front desk staff. He said, I'm sorry, I know it's not your fault. And I was just tired and I took it out on you. I'm sorry. And I remember just feeling so good about that interaction, partly because he apologized and it ended well. But the other part of it is that he's likely to tell that story to other people.
Right. It's true. And that's one of the things that I know about the hospitality industry, just in general, that customer service goes a long way in either direction. So if you give excellent first-class service, then it will have such a tremendous ripple effect. And if it's a one-off or if you genuinely don't have good service, it's going to have a similar ripple effect. Mm-hmm. So every interaction with every guest, it was just always important and, you know, kind of drilled into us, like be an ambassador of the hotel. And, you know, every interaction matters, whether it's with the person, the greeter at the door has maybe a better chance than anyone else of making a person feel very welcome, especially
or not.
Right, or not, especially if it's their first time ever coming to that hotel. So
Exactly. And I'm always amazed when people leave that to the lowest common denominator, whether it is front desk staff at a nice hotel or a receptionist in your building, to leave it and pay that position the least amount of money. And I'm just so puzzled by that. This is your first interaction with your potential clients.
And our doorman, I mean, I remember we all would go by, the sales team. We always went by and we're like, Tommy, you're doing great. We are so appreciative of everything you do. Our clients love you. We would always give him accolades and tell his managers and always try to keep him smiling. I mean, he opened the door when I was there for 20 years, every day,
Wow.
day in and day out, 20 years. Opened the door and had the biggest, brightest smile you could imagine. And people came to the hotel wanting to see Tommy. So it was like, you wanted him to know that and to just, it was a natural, luckily for us, fortunately, it was a natural thing for him. He enjoyed being pleasant and nice to people. And I honestly, in the entire time I worked with him, I never saw him have a bad day.
I love that. The thing is, though, I'm sure he did.
Right. He just didn't let it show.
Exactly. And there's a time and a place to let it show. Mm-hmm. And my guess, and this is something that I do, if I'm not having that kind of day and it is expected that I will have a good day, I may actually call in and say, I'm not feeling well or whatever, because I would rather not be there than to be there and provide bad service.
Exactly.
So, yeah. And I think as bosses, we have to recognize that too, that if 95%, 97% of the time, this person shows up with a smile on their face and they can set aside any drama that's going on at home and provide that smile for your customers. But once in a while, they're not feeling it. So you either put them in a different position that day, let them do something else that needs to be done in the building, or, let them go home, because we are human and there's always going to be a time when we cannot put that smile on our face.
Right.
There's just always a time, hopefully not very often, but it happens. Wow. Well, this has been kind of enlightening. You brought up a few things that I hadn't really considered before, and I'm so glad you took the time to chat with me on this podcast. So
thank you for asking me. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah. There are so many stories that we could share about hospitality and restaurant industry and how those stories impact us and our guests later on. As we all know, a criticism will go 10 times further than a compliment in any industry.
Right.
And so if you're thinking in advance about the stories you want your customers to tell when they leave, I think there's so much potential there.
I agree.
Well, thanks again. And I will I'll have an associated blog post on my website with information about you and your business. So if our listeners are interested in connecting with you on LinkedIn or checking out your website, meeting matchmakers, the links will be on my website, elkinsconsulting.com, with the blog post associated with this podcast episode. So thanks again, Suzanne, and we will talk again soon, I'm sure.
Thanks so much, Sarah.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com.
How could you tell me that you're going away?